Hello class! Today we are going to begin by going over Chapter 3, and Chapter 3 is about ecosystems. So as you go through the material in the book about Chapter 3, you'll get a really good feel for all of the different types of ecosystems that are on different continents. And here in this picture you get a glimpse of just a few of them. So our planet has a lot of diversity in the types of ecosystems that exist. And so in this chapter, we're going to go over a little bit of the material that makes up an ecosystem. And we're also going to go over different types of biomes. So we'll talk about what a biome is. And then we'll go over different kinds of those. Let's go ahead and dive into this chapter. Remember that before you get started on a chapter, you want to have always read the textbook. So just click on the part that says reading and go through those. It doesn't take a long time, and that really gives you a feel for what we're actually talking about. Versus if you listen to just the lecture without reading it, it can be difficult to always know exactly what material we're covering, and to understand it all just from the video is difficult. So you want to make sure you've read the textbook and then start the video. Okay, so let's begin. In this chapter, we want to discuss what an ecosystem is. So when you think of an individual organism, here we have a little picture of a little fish. You could imagine it to be Nemo. When the little fish is by itself, it's just an individual. But then when there are a group of them, and they're all part of the same species, we refer to that as a population. Now, for a population to turn into a community, you have to include other types of organisms. So if you look in a community, you would have different types of animals. You could have humans interacting with their dogs. That would be like a community. But an ecosystem is even broader than that. In the ecosystem, you don't consider just the parts that are living. So for example, if we were considering an ecosystem in Los Angeles, we would consider the people, maybe all of their pets, and then we would also consider their abiotic environment. So that has to do with the part that's not living. So for example, the soil underneath the ground where you live, that's a part of the abiotic environment. If we consider the water, if you happen to live near the beach or if you happen to live near a body of water, that's an abiotic part of the environment. But when we think about an ecosystem, it includes those living and non-living components. So that's a really important definition to know what an ecosystem is. So there are three main classifications for ecosystems. We can get very, very specific, or we can just have general classifications. But three general types of ecosystems are marine. So marine ecosystems refers to things like water, right? So here, for example, you could imagine a marine ecosystem. And then there's also freshwater ecosystems. So this has to do with the percentage of salinity or the percentage of salt in the water. So freshwater would be like less than 1% salt. And then there's terrestrial ecosystems, and those are ecosystems on land, like the ones you can see pictured here on the bottom part of the slide. Now, why do we cover ecosystems in this class? Why is it important for us to think about how the living and the non-living interact? Why can't we just think of ourselves as humans walking on some ground with our dog or with our cat? Why do we have to consider the ground and the air and the water? Well, the reason is because matter actually cycles in an ecosystem. So before we can understand that, let's think about what is matter itself. So matter is anything or something specific that occupies space and has a mass. So if you were to think of your pencil or your pen, they are made up of matter. How do you know that? Well, they're taking up some space if they're sitting on your desk or if you're holding it in your hand. It's taking up space, and then it also has some mass, meaning if you put it on a weigh scale, you could actually measure the mass in grams or kilograms. And so matter is made up of different elements. If you remember in chemistry in high school taking a chemistry class where you had the periodic table of elements, all of those elements are things that comprise matter. So things like aluminum, sodium, chloride, carbon, oxygen, those are all different types of elements. When we put them together in different ratios, we get different forms of matter. So for example, water is matter. It occupies space and it has a mass. Wood would be a type of matter. Paper would be a type of matter. Plastic, glass, right? All of those things are different types of matter. And what's interesting about matter is that in an ecosystem, it actually cycles, meaning it doesn't stay in one spot. So for example, when we think of water in an ecosystem, it doesn't stay stagnant. It doesn't stay still. It's actually cycling all the time. And so it doesn't just disappear or leave. It cycles and gets recycled, and it changes where it is. So for example, if you think of a leaf and you think of a leaf that's received a lot of water, it might look really nice and fresh and green. And then if you imagine a leaf that has dried out, what happened to it? Well, some matter left that leaf. So water left the leaf as it cycled from being inside the leaf to then having evaporated and being in the atmosphere. So while matter is cycling, energy is flowing. So when we think about an ecosystem, we want to think of how is energy moving through the ecosystem and how is matter cycling in the ecosystem. So even something as simple as you eating your lunch, let's say you ate an apple and you had a bottle of water and maybe you had some vegetables. You got energy from the apple and the vegetables, right? But where did that energy come from? And some of you might say, well, the energy came from the apple. But where did the apple get the energy from? Right? And we could say, well, it got it from the apple tree that it grew on. And where did the tree get that energy from? Well, it came from the soil, it came from the water that the tree absorbed, it came from the atmosphere, right? So energy is flowing not only from all of those parts of the ecosystem to the apple, but also then from the apple to you when you eat it, right? So energy is constantly flowing through an ecosystem, and matter is constantly cycling in an ecosystem. So here's a picture of that. It's just sort of a cartoon picture, but it can help you to understand some of those basic concepts. So if we think of the source of a lot of our energy, it's from the sun, right? So our sun provides light energy for plants to grow, right, via photosynthesis. So the plants use the energy from the sun plus water and nutrients in the soil to grow. And then consumers, like for example this little grasshopper, comes along and then consumes some of that produced energy. And then we could think of a bigger consumer, like a little mouse, coming along and eating that insect. And then a larger organism, let's say a snake, it's also a consumer, consumes the mouse. And then an even larger consumer, we go by levels here, we would call these primary, secondary, tertiary consumers. And then the largest consumer could eventually die and then decompose. When it decomposes, the nutrients in that organism as they're decomposing enrich the soil, and again that then helps the producers, the plants, to grow. So here in this little simple cartoon picture you can get the idea that matter is cycling, energy is flowing. So energy flows from one organism to the next organism. So when we consume, let's say, chicken in a chicken sandwich, we are getting energy from that chicken. Now, the really interesting thing is that we actually don't get 100% of the energy. A lot of energy, when it transfers from one organism to the other, is actually lost. So it's lost in the form of heat. And so when you consume food, you don't get 100% of the energy that's in that food. So a lot of that energy gets dissipated and lost and transferred to the atmosphere. So let's look at another kind of example of the same type of thing, right? We have the sun, and the sun is giving energy to plants, and so plants are a form of a producer because they can take the energy of the sun and produce carbohydrates. So for example, if you think of corn growing or apples or oranges, right? Or let's say you think of something really sweet like a strawberry. Where does that sugar come from, right? It came from the energy from the sunlight plus water, the nutrients in the soil, right? That produced energy. And then other organisms, let's say little insects, come along and consume that produced energy. As larger organisms eat smaller organisms, not 100% of the energy is transferred to that larger organism. Some of the energy is dissipated or lost as heat. So you always want to imagine that some of the energy is getting lost, right? It's not 100% perfect transfer. So energy is always kind of getting lost and recycled through an ecosystem. So let's take a look at how energy flows through ecosystems. So when we think of energy flowing, we often will think of a food chain. And so a food chain you might have heard of in terms of a small animal getting eaten by a bigger animal. When we think of an ecosystem, we want to think of producers. Now, a good hint to think of a producer is to think of something green. Producers are often green because they contain a pigment called chlorophyll, and that pigment helps them to do photosynthesis. That pigment lets them use energy from the sun to grow. And so we don't have that pigment, that's why we're not green, but plants do, and algae do as well. And so what that allows a producer to do is to generate large amounts of energy. So if you think of something like an orange tree, all of those oranges and all of the calories and all of the energy and the vitamin C that's inside of that orange, where did it come from? It really came from the energy from the sun, the elements in the atmosphere, water, and the soil. That allowed that plant to produce energy. So producers are things like plants, algae, cyanobacteria, and then consumers are sometimes small organisms, but they can also be larger organisms, like even a human. So we divide consumers into different categories, into primary consumers, those are usually small ones, and then secondary consumers, that's going to be something a little bit bigger, and then tertiary consumers, they're usually the largest. So here in this picture you can see algae being consumed by a mollusk, and then the mollusk being consumed by a small fish as a secondary consumer, and then the tertiary consumer coming along and consuming the small fish, and that's going to be a big fish, right, consuming the smaller one. And what's interesting to note in an ecosystem is that the larger salmon fish does not get 100% of the energy from the smaller fish. Some of that energy is lost in the form of heat. So when you eat something, you don't get 100% of the energy. A lot of the energy is actually lost to heat. And where does that heat go? It goes into the atmosphere, and then that contributes to the ecosystem. So the picture we saw on the slide before was a really simple model of how a food chain can go from kind of small to big, but a realistic food chain or a food diagram is more like a web, because organisms eat different organisms at different times. Larger organisms eat smaller organisms. So in reality, you'll often see a web that looks like this, where it's much more complicated. You don't have to memorize the names of the structures and the names of the organisms in this food web, but check out the bottom of the food web. You'll notice at the bottom are lots of producers, right? Green algae, cyanobacteria, and then they're getting eaten by smaller organisms, and then the larger fish are eating the smaller organisms. So when we think about this food web, we would imagine energy flowing. We would imagine the larger organisms not getting 100% of the energy, because a lot of that energy is going to be lost as heat. So when we look at an ecosystem, we divide organisms into different trophic levels. And so we would consider consumers to be in one trophic level. We would consider producers to be in another trophic level. And then we divide the consumers largely based on size. So smaller consumers are called primary consumers, bigger ones are secondary, and then the largest of all are tertiary consumers. So when tertiary consumers consume smaller organisms, what's interesting is that they don't get 100% of the energy. Instead, they get just about 10%. 90% of that energy gets lost as heat. So what does that mean? That means every time an organism is eating an organism in another trophic level, about 90% of the energy is declining or is getting lost. So we would say that any time energy moves from a producer to a consumer, from a consumer to a secondary consumer, to a tertiary consumer, we would say that there's a 90% decline in energy, right? Think of how much energy is over here for the producers, things like grass and plants. And then by the time the primary consumer gets it, 90% of the energy is gone. And then for the secondary consumer, 90% is gone. And then for the tertiary consumer, 90% is gone. So what we're getting is very little at the highest trophic level, very little energy. So this is just a reminder to think back about what we went over in a previous slide, that we have energy from the sun and the atmosphere and soil, and that's what helps producers grow. And producers then get eaten by consumers. And when consumers eat the producers, they don't get 100% of the energy. They only get about 10%. The rest of it, what happens to the rest of that energy? It gets lost as heat. So that's definitely something important to know for a test or for an exam, is that what happens to all the energy that gets lost in an ecosystem? It gets lost as heat. So in an ecosystem, we describe organisms with different names. So we've used the name producers and consumers. We're going to go over two additional names, which are photoautotrophs and chemoautotrophs. Now the difference between these two types of autotrophic organisms is what they use as an energy source. So photoautotrophs use sunlight as an energy source. Chemoautotrophs use inorganic molecules as an energy source. So what's an example of a photoautotroph? A great example would be a plant. So a plant can use sunlight as an energy source. You and I are not considered examples of photoautotrophs. Why not? Because we don't use energy from the sun. So why are these photoautotrophs so important? Because the energy that they get from the sun, and then that energy that they use to produce nutrients, are the nutrients that we all depend on for energy. So life as we know it on our planet would not exist without producers, right? The energy that's in plants and photoautotrophs is what allows our ecosystems to function, right? Think of anything that you eat, and if you go back and back and back, and if you think, well, what if you ate just animals and you never ate a green vegetable? Well, those animals depend on producers to live, right? So we really are dependent on the energy from producer organisms for life. So now when we look at that same picture again, we have plants right here in the middle. And so plants are an example of a photoautotroph, right? And they use light as an energy source. And they also take resources from the atmosphere, so elements in the atmosphere, particles in the hydrosphere like water, nutrients from the lithosphere, which is the soil. So the water, the soil, the atmosphere, it all comes together to provide energy for the producers to grow. And the energy that the producers generate is then consumed by consumers. And when those consumers eat the producer, they don't get 100% of the energy, they only get about 10%. So the next part of the chapter is going to look at biogeochemical cycles, and that looks at how matter cycles in an ecosystem. So in the previous part of this lecture, we've been talking about how energy flows. Now we're going to look at how does matter cycle. Matter cycles through an ecosystem. And I put this little picture in the beginning of this section of the lecture to remind you of these little toys. I don't know if you ever remember playing with them, or if you have like kids or nieces and nephews or family members that have little kids. They often will play with this kind of game, and they'll take one of these little beads and they'll take it on this round path and put it over here, and then they'll take another one of the little beads and then push it through this little path and end up over here. I use this little picture just because this is a lot like what happens to matter. Matter kind of goes through a lot of different cycles, and it travels through kind of a backward, forth, and roundabout journey. And when we think of the matter that's doing it, we want to think of the elements that are really crucial for humans to live. So what are the elements that we need that we wouldn't be able to survive without? Okay, so here's a list of them. If you want to think of a mnemonic, it's like CHOMPS, or some people say CHON PS, either one, whatever you want to think of. But the elements are carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur. CHONPS. Why are these elements important? Well, these are the elements that we need on Earth to live. Basically, we need carbon for a lot of our cellular functioning. We need hydrogen and oxygen, for H2O for water. We need nitrogen for soil and for plants to grow. We need phosphorus and sulfur. These are really important elements that allow ecosystems to function. And so we're going to think of these as matter. Why? Because matter, remember, is made up of elements. And so each one of these is an element. And matter cycles through an ecosystem. So we're going to look at how each of these elements cycles kind of in a crazy fashion all around an ecosystem. So let's look at this picture together, and it might look a little crazy at first, but it's pretty simple once we break it down. So remember, we're talking about matter. What is matter again? Matter is anything or something that occupies space and has mass. So you are made up of matter. Your pencil, your mouse, your computer, your cell phone, your hair, your chair, your desk, your light fixtures, your door, everything is made up of matter. And so when we think of matter, we can group it into different parts. We can group it into living parts and non-living parts. And so when we think of those parts and how they work together, remember we talked about how the non-living things are things like the air, the water of the hydrosphere, the lithosphere, the soil. Those are all the non-living parts. But there are also living types of matter, And what we're going to think about is, how do the living and the non-living interact with one another, right? When we think of an ecosystem, we're interested in how do living and non-living things cycle, right? How does this stuff go around and around, and how does it interchange with one another? And so remember those elements: carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur. Those elements all go through a cycle. So there's a water cycle for the hydrogen and oxygen, there's a carbon cycle, there's a nitrogen cycle, there's a phosphorus cycle. And so these cycles are going to allow these elements to move through an ecosystem. So none of them stays in a nice little box. They move around and around and around in an ecosystem. And some of them are limited, right? So for example, nitrogen and phosphorus are limiting nutrients, so we don't have unlimited quantities of them. And then in the nitrogen cycle, we go through a process called nitrogen fixation. We'll look at that when we get to the nitrogen cycle. So we're going to focus in the upcoming slides on biogeochemical cycles. And what are those? Those are basically cycles that show you how these elements, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur, how they move through an ecosystem. So let's start with water. We're going to do the water cycle first. And when we think about water, we want to think about water in an ecosystem. And so when we look at all the ecosystems on Earth, about 97.5% of the water available on Earth is salt water. So if you think of like the ocean and the salt water that's there, what's left? Well, the fresh water is just about 2.5%. Right? And so that's divided into categories like lakes and rivers, groundwater and glaciers and snow, like the parts of the Earth that are permanently covered with snow. When we think about water and how it's moving through an ecosystem, we want to look at specifically, how does water move, right? And where does it go? And how does it travel through an ecosystem? So just before we begin that, it might be helpful for you to just look at this pie chart and know that, okay, the majority of the water on Earth is salt water. You should know that, right? 97% of the water on Earth is salt water. And then a little tiny bit is fresh water, right? Just less than 3%. So the first cycle that we want to look at is the water cycle. So when you look at this picture, let's start on the right-hand side with the ocean. So you can see the ocean there in the picture, and now you're going to imagine the sun shining really brightly. And when the sun is shining, that's going to cause some of that water to evaporate. And when it evaporates, where does it go? It goes into the atmosphere. And in the clouds, condensation takes place. And that condensation traps some of the water in the clouds until later precipitation causes that water to come back down. And then some of it can get absorbed into the soil. And then there can be groundwater discharge. And then again, that water can get evaporated. And then it can be trapped in the atmosphere as something like fog. There can be increased humidity where there's more water in the atmosphere. But in this picture, you get a sense for how water is moving through an ecosystem. The next cycle that we want to look at is the carbon cycle. And in this cycle, we want to consider how carbon is moving through an ecosystem. So the interesting thing about carbon is that humans contribute a lot to carbon dioxide in the atmosphere through emissions. Even every breath we exhale also releases carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Plants, when they're doing photosynthesis, use this carbon dioxide. There's also carbon released into the carbon cycle as rocks undergo erosion. There's soil that contains carbon as well. And so as all of these elements interact with one another, you can imagine carbon cycling through an ecosystem. So the next cycle that we want to talk about is the nitrogen cycle. And the nitrogen cycle involves nitrogen in the atmosphere that's in the form of nitrogen gas, but it also involves nitrogen that's found in the soil. And that nitrogen actually undergoes a process called nitrogen fixation by bacteria that turns it into ammonium. And when you imagine animals dying, decomposers feed on the dead tissue and they also produce ammonium that eventually gets turned into nitrates and then eventually goes through an assimilation process that plants can again use that nitrogen to help them to grow. So you can imagine how nitrogen is cycling through an ecosystem from the atmosphere to the soil and then back to the plant to help it to grow. The next element that we want to talk about is phosphorus. So phosphorus also cycles through an ecosystem, and one of the ways in which humans have impacted the phosphorus cycle is through the heavy application of fertilizers. So when we apply a lot of fertilizers to the land, some of that phosphorus ends up as runoff in the ocean. So for example, when it rains, some of that fertilizer ends up as part of ocean sediments and then eventually gets dissolved into the soil and then can cycle from the soil to the fertilizer to the oceans to the air. So phosphorus also moves through an ecosystem. And the last cycle that we want to talk about is the sulfur cycle. And in this cycle, we find that this element is actually present in the air. Right? So there's atmospheric sulfur. And because of the increased production of greenhouse gases through human emissions, we're increasing the amount of sulfur in the atmosphere. And some of that sulfur forms precipitation. So when it rains, a small amount of the rain contains sulfuric acids. And so that's sometimes referred to as acid rain. And as that rain then falls on the land, it forms soil sulfates as those sulfates clump together in the soil, and then as that decomposes, it then again can go into atmospheric sulfur. Some of the soil can also lead to runoff in the ocean that would allow for sulfur deposits to be in marine ecosystems as well. So you can see through each one of these element cycles that each one of these molecules moves from the atmosphere to the water to the soil, and they're constantly cycling through an ecosystem. And human emissions play a big part in that, and we'll talk about that later on in the semester, but basically as we produce more excess greenhouse gases, they contribute to increased atmospheric sulfur. Okay, the next portion of the chapter is talking about biomes. So we spent the beginning of the chapter talking about ecosystems, and now we're going to talk about the different biomes that exist on our planet. So what is a biome? It's basically like a big environment. So if you were to think of the environment on the bottom left-hand side of this slide and the environment on the top right, they look different, right? What differentiates them? Well, they have different temperature ranges, they have different amounts of rain, they have different amounts of sunlight. So they are huge environments that are distinguished from one another because they have varying temperatures and different amounts of rain. So you want to know, what is a biome? So we live in a biome, people in Antarctica live in a biome, people in South America live in biomes. We're not all living in the same biome, right? Each of those environments is characterized by a different type of temperature and a different amount of rain. So we want to go over them. So a great thing you could do as you're listening to this part of the lecture is to write down each of the biomes and write down maybe one or two characteristics of the biomes, and that'll help you to study them. So as we look at a map, we can actually see where each biome is. So for example, in this kind of orange color at the very top, at the very northern parts, you can see the Arctic tundra. Okay, in the kind of yellowish kind of coral color are the temperate forests and the temperate grasslands. And then right around the equator, you can see a little bit more of the tropical forests in green, right? Here, part of South America, parts of Africa, parts of Southeast Asia. You can see that each biome is found in different continents. So some continents have a lot of different biomes. Some continents have larger portions of one biome than another. But we're going to start in this section of the chapter by looking over the terrestrial biomes. So we're focusing on the land biomes. And what's interesting is that each one of them gets different amounts of rain. So this graph is showing you rain here on the y-axis and temperature here on the x-axis. So you'll notice that where it's the hottest and the rainiest would be the tropical rainforest. It's the highest temperature and the highest amount of rain. Okay, if we look at the coldest area, it would be the Arctic tundra, and it also gets the least amount of rain, right? So when we think of each biome, you can imagine the same types of animals can't always survive in different biomes, right? So each biome has its own unique organisms that thrive there. So let's start with our first biome. The first one that we're going to talk about is the tropical rainforest. And this is one that usually students have heard of and are kind of familiar with. And tropical rainforests are known for having sort of the most rich and the most lush foliage and a lot of different types of organisms. You could imagine monkeys and colorful birds. And they're usually found right near the equator, so right near the middle of the earth, and it's really hot and there's lots of rain, and you're going to imagine lots of organisms and lots of sunlight, and you could imagine it being really humid, and so that would be characteristic of a lot of South America and Southern Africa. The next biome that we're going to talk about are the savannas. Now, the savannas are also found in Africa, a little bit north of where the tropical rainforests are, and they're also found in northern Australia, and these are areas that are very hot as well, but the main difference here is that you would not see the same amount of rain. So it's going to be really, really dry. And so these areas are known for having a lot of fires. This is a really common tree seen in the savannas a lot. This is called an acacia tree. You may have often seen it in a picture with a lion. You'll see this type of tree. So it's just a common sight in the savannas. Another biome is a desert. So a subtropical desert is very, very dry. So as soon as you hear the word desert, you're immediately going to be thinking of dry. And then there's not that many different types of species. So you're not going to see hundreds of different types of organisms all in this type of biome. You're going to see a lot of flat, dry desert area. Okay, the next biome should be of interest to you because it is where you live. So in Southern California, specifically Rio Hondo, we are in a chaparral biome. So if you take a hike just right behind campus, you would see a picture that looks very similar to this. We live in a chaparral and we have a very dry climate, so that means our summers we don't get much rain, right? If we do get rain, it's going to largely be in the winter months, right? In terms of vegetation, we would have a lot of shrubs. We would have things like coastal sage and buckwheat and types of plants that are well adapted to going a long period of time without rain. This chaparral biome is also found in parts of the Mediterranean. So if you think off of the southern coast of Australia, places where oftentimes people really like to visit because it's usually considered a really mild summer and not a lot of rain and a really comfortable climate. The next biome that we want to talk about are temperate grasslands. So when you think of a temperate grassland, you would really want to imagine this picture where you just kind of see lots of tall grass. You don't really see like big mountains. There's a few trees, but they're mainly just near bodies of water. You would want to imagine a cold winter and a warm summer, and these are often just called like a prairie, kind of like flat land. And a lot of Central North America has this type of biome. So if you think of states like Nebraska, Wyoming, South Dakota, and they're usually not heavily populated in the United States. A lot of the land has just remained like this. Our next biome are temperate rainforests. And if you think of like states in the East Coast, like the New England area, these are known as temperate forests. And they're really known for having very strong seasons, meaning there is a very cold winter, there's a really hot summer, there's a really defined springtime, right? And so they get rain throughout the year. They get rain almost every month of the year. They have a lot of trees, so like you can see, and the word forest would definitely clue you into that. And you could imagine these areas as really being known for having a climate that changes, right? If you imagine Southern California, and we kind of stay pretty normal temperature throughout the year, versus in temperate forests, you're going to see huge swings from it being very, very cold to very, very hot. The next biome that we want to talk about are boreal forests. And boreal forests are not that common in the United States, but we do have them in Alaska and north in Canada, and large parts of Russia and Europe are made up of these forests. And you want to imagine it being very, very cold for a long time. And the summer season is really quick. And you want to imagine a lot of trees that to us look like Christmas trees. There's a lot of pine trees, spruce trees, fir trees, and you want to imagine kind of mountain ranges in the background covered with snow. That's what you should picture for a boreal forest. Now the coldest of all, although a boreal forest is cold, much, much, much colder is the Arctic tundra. And so this would be like what you would imagine of Antarctica. It's very, very cold, right? You're not going to imagine any plants growing, right? Except just really, really small shrubs, a little bit of grass here and there. But the majority of what you're going to see is snow, right? Snow as far as the eye can see. And so because it's so cold, not a lot of that snow gets a chance to evaporate. So it stays as snow, and there isn't a lot of rain, and so you're just imagining bitter, bitter cold. That's the Arctic tundra. Moving into aquatic biomes, so now we're thinking of water. One of the most beautiful biomes is the coral reef, and it's known for having thousands and thousands of different types of organisms that are really colorful and really bright and vibrant, and it's a really complex habitat. We're still learning about this area, and if you didn't know, even the coral in the picture is an animal. And so later on in the semester, we're going to learn more about the coral reefs, and we're going to learn about things like coral bleaching and how a lot of human activities and pollution have affected the coral reefs. And so some of that diversity is currently being threatened, but in a perfect scenario, the coral reefs have tons of diversity and tons of different organisms, and they're just absolutely beautiful, even just to look at pictures. Even if you just type in coral reefs into Google, you'll get some really beautiful images to look through. And our last biome, our last aquatic biome, are the freshwater biomes. And so we talked about how salt water makes up the majority, more than 97% of our water on Earth is salt water, but that little leftover, less than 3%, is freshwater biomes. And so these are things like lakes and ponds and wetlands. You can look at some of the pictures on this slide. And again, these are also, a lot of freshwater sites are really beautiful to look at. And so it's just an easy classification to think, okay, when you think of lakes and ponds, that's all of your freshwater biomes. So when we look back at this lecture, we've gone over some aquatic biomes, we've gone over some terrestrial biomes, we've gone over the biogeochemical cycles when we think about matter cycling. We've also talked about how energy flows, right? So when you look over chapter 3, there's a lot of interesting themes to think about ecosystems, right? To think about energy and matter and the biomes. And so hopefully, just in looking over this chapter, you've gotten a better feel for what different ecosystems are like around the world. And then in our upcoming lectures, we're going to talk more about specific parts of a lot of these ecosystems. Okay, so this brings us to the end of our lecture for today, and if you have any questions, feel free to contact me.